Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. When I tell you that today's conversation covers one of the best biographies I've ever read, I am not joking. A few weeks ago, I got the chance to sit down with Zaakir Tameez, author of an amazing treatment studying the life and legacy of Charles Sumner. Tameez is a scholar of antitrust and constitutional law and has published award-winning scholarship and co-authored amicus briefs before the Texas and United States Supreme Courts. He is also a Fulbright Scholar and Humanity in Action Senior Fellow from Houston, Texas. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, with me today is Zaakir Tameez. He is a graduate of Yale Law School and author of one of the best biographies written this year, Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Zaakir, welcome. I am so happy to have you.
I'm happy to be here, and thank you for your kind words about the book.
So let's dive in. You were a busy guy. You just graduated Yale Law School. What prompted you to write a biography of Charles Sumner?
The project started in law school when I was reading the brief that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP filed in Brown versus Board, the case that led to the integration of American public schools. And as I was reading Marshall's brief, I stumbled on the name of Charles Sumner, who's mentioned more than 40 times in the document. And I was shocked. I knew about Charles Sumner, just like you knew about Charles Sumner, as a U.S. Senator during the Civil War era. I had no idea that more than 100 years before Brown, Charles Sumner tried to integrate the schools of Boston in a case at the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And he actually collaborated with a young African-American attorney named Robert Morris. And this interracial collaboration to integrate schools 100 years before, even though it was unsuccessful, their arguments were used point by point by the NAACP and Marshall and Brown. And I felt like, my God, this story needs to be told.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue to one question that I had for you, which was about this case. So he argues in this case, Roberts v. City of Boston, it predates Brown by, almost a century. So what was it and what made it so important?
So Robert Morris was a young African-American attorney. And when I say young, I mean young. He was 26 years old. And he's the first black lawyer in our history to win a jury trial. Morris decided to represent a 5-year-old girl named Sarah Roberts, whose father wanted her to attend a white-only public school in Boston. At the time, Boston only allowed black students to attend one school, known as the Smith School. And so Morris files a lawsuit. He loses at district court. But then he goes to Charles Sumner and asks Sumner to join on the appeal. By this time, Charles Sumner is a Harvard-educated corporate lawyer in the city of Boston. And Sumner had for some time been very disenchanted with his career. He agrees not only to join Morris on the case, but to do so for free. And then together they argue the case on appeal at the Massachusetts Supreme Court. In this case, Sumner points to the Massachusetts state constitution, which had an equality provision, and to the Declaration of Independence, which said all men are created equal. And he argued, essentially, that just as we are all equal before God, we must also be equal before the law. And then he argues that equality before the law, an expression that he coined, requires us to be in schools together. Otherwise, even if two schools are quote-unquote equal in other respects, but if they are segregated, then students at the black school will face a stigma for life, even though their provisions were equal, even if that were possible. And so he argues that integrated schools are necessary. Effectively, the separate schools cannot be equal. They lose the case. But what is quite surprising is that only a few years later, in 1855, the Massachusetts state legislature passes a law integrating the schools of Boston. And that was a success of Morris, who campaigned for several years after losing the case at the legislature until he achieved this momentous victory in 1855.
And I think Sumner's part, really understanding Sumner's part, we got to back up a little bit. So can you talk about how did Sumner's youth contribute to his later activism?
So Sumner grew up in a series of contradictions. Let me tell you about two. The first contradiction is that he is a third-generation Harvard-educated man. His father went to Harvard and his grandfather went to Harvard. But he also grew up in poverty because his dad was a Harvard-educated lawyer who was really bad at being a lawyer. Really struggled to make money in the legal profession. Maybe that'll be me someday.
No, doubt it.
He had this aristocratic upbringing, but not the money and privilege that comes with an aristocratic upbringing. The second contradiction is that he actually grew up in an ethnic enclave of Boston with a large African American population. This area of Boston, Black Boston, had a vibrant, free community. Of course, they were oppressed and marginalized in 100 different respects, but they were also full of life. And Sumner, from a young age, sees Black schoolchildren going to the Smith School. He sees Black churchgoers going to the African Meeting House, one of the oldest churches in the country. And he sees Black Freemasons at the oldest Black Masonic lodge in the country, the Prince Hall Freemasonry. As he's growing up, though, he goes to the Boston Latin School. Then he goes to Harvard. He gets trained by a number of leading professors, including Joseph Story, a titan of American law, a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court at the time. And they inculcate him into a very conservative, aristocratic part of Boston. And next thing you know, Sumner is a Harvard-educated corporate lawyer. And yet, he still lived in his mother's home in the Black part of Boston. And he felt this guilt gnawing at him for many years as he leaves this poor, impoverished, oppressed neighborhood every day to go to work on Court Street, representing Boston merchants.
And you also mentioned when you're talking about the case of Roberts v. the City of Boston that Sumner kind of coined this phrase, equality under the law. I'm curious, can you talk about Sumner's early travel overseas and how this might have shaped his views on the possibility for change in the United States?
Yeah, so after Harvard, not unlike many college students today, Sumner wanted to go find himself. And he asked his professors to give him money, to lend him money, to go to Europe. Some of them are excited by this, others are very skeptical. The president of Harvard University, Josiah Quincy, said that you will come back with a cane, a mustache, and an additional dock of vanity. But sure enough, he does go. And when he is in France, he spends months mastering his French. He goes to more than 100 university lectures in French to get his arms around the language. And there he sees Black and white students sitting side by side learning philosophy at the Sorbonne. And that to him is a shocker, something never conceivable in America at the time. And so he realizes the possibility of a different future for the country. He is also meeting a number of French and English aristocrats, many of whom are extremely educated but completely ignorant of the United States. He met one Frenchman who he thought was very learned, who then asked him earnestly if Americans spoke the same language as Montezuma. And that was when he realized that his country at the time, this is in the 1830s, is essentially a backwater. It is not the kind of global superpower we have today. It was this random country on the other side of the Atlantic, and even for many Europeans, Even for many French people, if you're not Marquis de Lafayette, you may just know nothing about America. And so Sumner is troubled by this. But then what he realizes is if Europeans knew anything about America, what they knew was slavery. And they were quite disturbed by the slave system of chattel in the United States. And he is constantly being questioned about this. And so, over a couple years in Europe, he decides the necessity of one day abolishing slavery and of guaranteeing some form of equality before the law if the United States is ever to have international recognition and standing.
And, Conscience of a Nation, I think, is a very apt subtitle for Charles Sumner and his life's work. And if people know Charles Sumner who don't follow history so closely, they know about him being a senator and perhaps being attacked on the floor of the Senate. So can we talk about the attack and how that impacted Sumner's physically and mentally?
Yeah, so if we fast forward to 1856, Charles Sumner is now an abolitionist U.S. Senator. By this time, American democracy is under threat. In Kansas, there's going to be a vote on whether to become a slave state or a free state. Sumner had a colleague named David Rice Atchison, a former U.S. Senator from Missouri, former President pro tem of the Senate, who went back to Missouri, organized a gang of more than 1,000 men, and stormed into Kansas, taking over polling locations at gunpoint in order to make sure that Kansas became a slave state. This is a colleague basically organizing an insurrection with violence. And in Washington, many of Sumner's allies are being silent, are being very careful about their words because they're terrified. Why? They lived in Washington, D.C., a slave city, a southern city, where you could get harassed and accosted on the street for speaking out against slavery. Sumner decides that he will speak out, and he delivers a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, where he characterizes the situation as the, quote, rape of a virgin territory. He singles out Atchison and describes him as a Roman traitor who was ultimately hung for treason. He condemns President Franklin Pierce as a Roman dictator. He condemns Stephen Douglas, his northern colleague from Illinois, who helped to create the Kansas crisis, as Lucifer. And then he targets Senator Andrew Pickens Butler of South Carolina, who is a major slaveholder, who had previously mocked and bullied Sumner for his chastity and bachelorhood. And Sumner points out that Butler had a mistress, polluted in the sight of the world, but chaste in his own eyes. Quote, the harlot slavery. What Sumner is referring to, I think, is the fact that Butler, according to the evidence, probably had an enslaved mistress and sired 2 children by her. And Sumner is telling the whole world about Butler's proclivities. Unbeknownst to Sumner, Butler had a nephew named Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, who was very rambunctious and very aggressive, who had been complaining on the House floor that Southerners are not being aggressive enough. And by that, he meant physically. And so Brooks decides to attack Sumner. He gets a couple of his buddies involved, other Southern congressmen. They approach Sumner on the Senate floor during a recess 2 days after the speech. One of his buddies holds up a cane and possibly a pistol to make sure that nobody intervenes. Brooks approaches Sumner from the front with a gutta percha gold-tipped cane and starts to smash it over Sumner's head. He beats Sumner so viciously that Sumner goes unconscious. The cane shatters into pieces. And finally, another senator grabs Brooks from behind and pulls him back and says, "You're going to kill him, you're going to kill him." And Brooks responds, and he says, "I did not intend to kill him. I only intend to flog him." The language of flogging and whipping was then repeatedly invoked by Southern politicians, Southern newspapers, and Brooks himself to characterize what we now call the caning. What they were trying to express, is that Sumner was no better than a slave because he had spoken out for abolition. And Brooks is trying to show who's boss, Southern quote-unquote gentleman. So after the caning, Sumner spends years recovering. He goes to Europe again. There he meets an eccentric doctor named Charles Edward Brown-Séquard, who decides to, my God, it's hard to explain, but basically Brown-Séquard, he's one of the founders of modern neurology. He's a brilliant doctor. If there's any neurologists listening, they know the name because many disorders are named after Brown-Séquard. But Brown-Séquard is also eccentric, and he likes to experiment on his patients. And he decided that Sumner's injuries, which probably included a severe concussion, maybe occipital neuralgia, definitely included PTSD. Above his left ear, he had nearly an inch deep cut from the cane. So he's badly injured, and Brown-Séquard concludes that the treatment Sumner needs is to have fire burned on his bare back, because that would somehow alleviate his spinal cord. It goes very badly. Sumner now has all these burn wounds on his bare back. He eventually develops angina, and then he struggles with bad health for the rest of his life. It takes him years to recover. The first time he returns to the Senate, he has these terrible throbbing headaches, and he left and went home crying. He eventually does come back in 1860 when there's a new Senate chamber, the one that is still in use today, which probably alleviated the PTSD because he's no longer in the same room where he had been beaten so badly. But what is striking is that all this time, as he's going through these injuries, as he's going through this long period of suffering, he continues repeatedly over and over to the press and to friends, reminding them that what he is going through is nothing compared to what enslaved people experienced on a daily basis in the American South.
And Sumner takes his time. He takes his years of convalescence. He's there when Abraham Lincoln is elected into office and starts to develop a relationship with the newly elected president. Can we talk a little bit about the Trent Affair and how it impacted Sumner's relationship with President Lincoln?
Yeah. So one day in, I want to say, November 1861, Charles Sumner gets off a train in Boston, and a friend recognizes him and tells him that a Confederate ship on the way to England had been captured. And on the ship were two former U.S. Senators, Slidell and Mason, both slaveocrats, now Confederates, who Sumner knew personally only a couple years ago. The North is celebrating this capture because this is at a time in which the Confederacy is gaining ground. Many Northerners are worried because the North has lost several major battles by this point. And here's a nice little victory. The North has captured a Confederate ship and captured two leading Confederate politicians who are in fact on the way to Great Britain to try to meet with Queen Victoria and with leading British diplomats. Sumner tells his friend at the train station that they need to be let go immediately. I'm sure the friend was quite surprised. You're at war with the Confederacy. Why would you let these two people go? But Sumner insists that it probably makes sense to let them go. And over the next few weeks, it becomes clear why. Around this time, I think there's around 10-day delay between news in England and the United States. That's how long it took for a ship to cross the ocean. Steamboats are now in full action. And while America is celebrating this capture, Great Britain is furious. And there is the drumbeat of war going on in London. We have to remember that the largest manufacturing industry in England at this time is textiles. And textiles were primarily fed by southern slave-produced cotton from the United States. So the United Kingdom had a financial interest in standing up for the Confederacy. And in fact, Queen Victoria had already issued a proclamation of neutrality, which angered Lincoln because the United Kingdom didn't just come out in support of the North. There's also many English aristocrats who would be delighted to see American democracy fall apart, still smarting over the revolution against King George decades ago. Sumner also recognized that if there was any chance to avoid the British from ultimately becoming involved in the American Civil War, it would be if the war was defined around the politics of anti-slavery. There are many British abolitionists, and many British aristocrats like to think of themselves as enlightened men who, even though were engaging in vast colonial oppression across the world, also shared a disdain for slavery. And they would have been very uncomfortable if they saw their own country as getting involved in a war to protect slavery. The British at the time did not see it that way because all the communications coming from the White House were that this was not a war about slavery. In 1861, Lincoln had been repeatedly insisting that this war had very little to do with slavery because he was afraid of losing the border states. So that's a quick thing of all the different geopolitical angles to what is going on in the Trent affair. But now let me just go to when Sumner returns to Washington, D.C. to meet with Abraham Lincoln to resolve this affair. Sumner gets to Washington, and at first, pretty much the entire White House cabinet believes that Lincoln should keep these Confederate politicians as prisoners of war. Sumner, meanwhile, is arguing that no, they should be either released or the United States should agree to an arbitration process with Britain and consent to whatever decision the arbitrator makes. Secretary of State William Seward, who at one point was very furious with Great Britain as well, had gotten cold feet as he recognized that the British could actually get involved in this conflict. And as they're sitting in the room debating this, an aide comes into the room and says that France just put out a statement in support of Great Britain. So then the cabinet gets really panicked. And over the next couple of weeks, Lincoln ultimately does decide to release these Confederates. And so Sumner came out victorious in this moment. Lincoln, for the rest of his presidency, would lean on Sumner for foreign policy advice. Sumner is the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at this time. He's also traveled all over Europe and spoke 6 languages, unlike Lincoln, who had only spoken 1. And Sumner becomes a kind of leading foreign policy thinker throughout the Civil War, particularly as it related to keeping the British lion out of the conflict.
And Sumner wasn't just close and influential with President Lincoln. He also developed a close relationship with First Lady Mary Lincoln. So can you talk a little bit about that and how that relationship developed?
Mary Todd Lincoln loved to practice her French. And in Washington, D.C., there were very few people who could speak French. America is still a backwater at this time in 1861, in 1862, and so forth. And so Mary Todd Lincoln sparks up a friendship with Charles Sumner, who loved French. And together they would practice it. Eventually, Mary Todd would invite Sumner to join her at the opera, at the theater. He was basically her go-to date whenever her husband, President of the United States, was not available. There's a great letter from Abraham Lincoln to Charles Sumner where he says, Mrs. L is embarrassed a little, but she asked me to invite you to go to the opera with her. So it's real funny. And Lincoln, I think, felt very grateful to Sumner as well, because he has this nagging wife who was constantly pestering him to spend more time with her when he felt like he had a country to run. And Sumner would happily take on that role. Now, that friendship also has political utility. Over the course of the war, Sumner persuades Mary Todd Lincoln that the war should be a war for abolition, that this should be a war to end slavery. Mary Todd Lincoln grew up on a plantation in Kentucky. She has several brothers fighting for the Confederacy, which made things extremely awkward, as you can imagine, for the family dynamic. And she had always had a slight disdain for slavery, but she never thought about it very much until she met Charles Sumner. And over the course of the war, Mary Todd Lincoln begins to call herself an abolitionist. And she brags that she's far more of an abolitionist than her husband, and that her husband needs to catch up with her. For many years, Mary Todd Lincoln has gotten a very bad rap for being a spendthrift, for being probably bipolar, for being not a very good wife. And some of it's accurate, some of it's deeply misogynistic. But one thing that she did is that she helped to persuade her husband to ultimately do what he did, which is write the Emancipation Proclamation. And when that proclamation is written, Charles Sumner helped Lincoln with the final sentence. And when Lincoln signs the document, he gives Charles Sumner the pen that he used, which is now in a museum in Boston.
For all of his, great pieces to his personality, Sumner was also notoriously stubborn. So in being a senator and dealing with many federal administrators, how did this impact his relationship with the Secretary of State, Seward?
Yeah, so Sumner being stubborn is an understatement. He had a friend named Carl Schurz who said that Charles Sumner is not the sort of man you can go up to, pat on the back, and say, "Hey, Charlie, how are you?" He's extremely serious. He didn't have a sense of humor. He's very stubborn and strong-willed. He's also 6'4", barrel-chested, broad-shouldered, and for many years he had been talking about the evils of slavery, and he had even warned in 1854 that America was on the verge of a parricidal, fratricidal war, a war more wicked than any in the annals of human history. And so he felt so vindicated, and he felt like all the people who had been telling him for many years that he was fanatical and wrong should be ignored. And that included the Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward and Sumner had been friends throughout the 1850s. They were two of very few anti-slavery senators in Washington, and so they were chums in that respect. But things go sour, beginning with the secession of South Carolina in December of 1860. Nowadays, we think that South Carolina seceded, and then the following day was the bombing of Fort Sumter and the start of Civil War. Actually, there was a long period between December of 1861 and when the war began in May, known as Secession Winter, where time moved so slowly, because with each passing day, the North was trying to decide what to do. Many abolitionists said, let the South go. Let them be on their own, and we'll just make a much larger underground railroad to allow enslaved people to escape. Many Northerners who were not abolitionists also said, let the South go. We don't need a war. Then there were other Northerners who said, no, the Union needs to be brought together. Let's go to war. And then there were abolitionists who said, let's go to war to abolish slavery. And then, finally, there were the compromisers who said, we must avoid war at all costs. We must bring back the Union on whatever compromise the South is willing to make. Seward was one of those. He had been an anti-slavery figure for many years. He had even given money to Harriet Tubman to live on a farm in upstate New York. And yet, even more than he hated slavery, he hated war. And he feared civil war so much that he was willing to make compromises to continue to perpetuate the institution of slavery. Seward, according to his wife, was willing to basically make a compromise over human flesh. I don't recall the exact quote, but his wife was furious with him over doing this. But Seward made a number of overtures to the South. He even went behind Lincoln's back and told a few Southerners that the president planned to allow them to take Fort Sumter, which was not true at all, and Seward was kind of acting out on his own. His behavior was extremely erratic in the first few months of the Lincoln presidency. What I only can conclude was the stress of being in this conflict seemed to have really gotten to his head, and he was panicky. As I said, he was frequently provoking Great Britain. There was one moment at a dinner where he started screaming at the British ambassador and the French ambassador and threatening them with war. Really troubling things, in my view. But at the same time, Seward appreciated that the Civil War could only be won if the border states were preserved within the Union. Sumner did not appreciate that at all. So Seward is consistently putting out memos, particularly to foreign ambassadors, telling them, reminding them, to tell the world that this is a war to bring back the Union, not a war against slavery. Because if this is a war against slavery, the border states, which still had slavery, would leave and join the Confederacy. And that included Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, possibly. Sumner, meanwhile, is panicking because if foreign ambassadors are telling their foreign governments that this is a war to bring back the Union, those foreign governments are going to be way more sympathetic to the Confederacy, seeing it as a battle between a bureaucratic, controlling North and the Southerners who simply wanted their own national identity. Many Europeans compared the Confederate Rebellion to the rebellions of 1848 in Europe. And so Sumner and Seward have this constant tug of war between the two. They had once been close. Now they're not quite mortal enemies, but are real political enemies. And yet they still had to work together because Seward is Secretary of State and Sumner is Chair of Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And they do work together for the rest of their lives.
You document throughout the book. It's I think a very common theme throughout your book that Sumner, who had this strong belief in human rights, and that this was way ahead of his time. So can you expand on this and share how Sumner infused his belief into his speeches?
Let me tell you a story. Let's fast forward past secession crisis, the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's skip Gettysburg and Chancellorsville. Let's skip the 13th, 14th Amendments, none of that's important. And let's go to the day that the 15th Amendment was ratified. Yeah, okay, it's a little important. It's a little. But let's move past all that and go to the day that the 15th Amendment was ratified. On this day, there's a party going on in Washington, D.C. by black churchgoers who are celebrating the fact that now black men have a right to vote across the United States. The party reaches Charles Sumner's house. Someone calls Sumner to come outside onto his front lawn and address the crowd. And he comes out and he is grumpy. And he tells them that it's not in his nature to celebrate when there's still more work to be done. And he points out that they're still shut out of the common school. They're shut out of the restaurant, shut out of the hotel. At this time, Sumner had been working with a black law professor named John Mercer Langston to draft a civil rights bill that would create a right of public accommodation for anyone regardless of race to enter into a common carrier and sue for damages if they are denied for discriminatory purposes. It's a visionary bill. If it sounds familiar, that's because this bill is the blueprint for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, Sumner introduces this bill, and it is not getting traction in Washington, D.C. Even many Republican anti-slavery politicians are uncomfortable with the idea of racial integration. They were anti-slavery. They were not pro-equality. And some of his colleagues decided to object not on moral grounds, but on constitutional grounds. They claimed that this bill was a dramatic federal overreach and would violate the time-old principle of American jurisprudence, state rights. Sumner responds to one of his colleagues, and he says, quote, "You are referring to the old method of interpretation. I am referring to the new method of constitutional interpretation that was conquered at Appomattox. Appomattox being the last battle of the Civil War." And he says, under the new rule, every clause and every line and every word of the Constitution is to be construed uniformly and thoroughly for human rights. He later on says, there can be no state rights against human rights. He says that the greatest victory of the Civil War was the emancipation of the Constitution. He later says that America should now pursue the imperialism of human rights. So he has this broad human rights-oriented vision of constitutional law. He thought the Civil War itself inaugurated this new method of human rights constitutionalism. If that wasn't enough for some people, he pointed to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as further validating this new interpretive scheme. And to him, he kept using the word human rights over and over in his speeches, nearly 300 times in all. I counted.
And you do mention that despite Sumner's push for human rights, he did have a blind spot when it came to Indigenous Americans. So can you talk a little bit about this contradiction?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate one. Whenever we look at historical figures, we are going to find something, a blind spot or two or three or 20. In Sumner's case, one of his blind spots was the ongoing genocide against Native people, particularly in the American West. If we go back to the Kansas crisis that I described earlier, Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, famously debated Abraham Lincoln a few years later, had introduced the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which is proposing to allow Kansas to become a state as either a free state or a slave state. There was another piece to the bill, which was essentially proposing a scheme of ethnically cleansing the several native tribes that lived in Kansas and Nebraska. Some of those tribes were indigenous to those lands. Other tribes had been forcibly relocated there already. And now the United States is about to pursue a plan to ethnically cleanse that land even further. Sumner had a colleague named Sam Houston, a senator from Texas, who spoke out over and over and over again against this bill, even though it was pro-South, because of what it would do to Native people. Sam Houston had a lot of relationships with the Cherokee and kept pointing out this plight. Houston collaborated with Sumner in opposing this bill, but Sumner only spoke about the impact it would have on slavery. He never spoke about the impact it could have on Native Americans. Throughout his career, I found two instances where he talked about what was happening to Native Americans. On both occasions, he condemned massacres that the United States Army were pursuing, a new form of slavery that was being pursued by New Mexico against indigenous people there. So he was sympathetic to the plight of Native people, but it was something so low in his priority list, perhaps something he was deeply ignorant about, being from New England, that he didn't give it much thought. The last thing I'll say is that he worked with William Seward on a plan to annex Alaska and to take Alaska from Russia, which was selling the land. And Sumner both supported the plan and also did a great deal of work to garner public support for what many people thought was an expensive purchase of a land of just walruses and ice. I'm not joking. That's exactly what senators were saying. They were like, why do we want this land of walruses? Why are we paying $17 million for this? And Sumner then decided to basically write a book about Alaska. And he calls the place Alaska, a name that either he had come up with or that he popularized, that was based on a term that some indigenous people in Alaska used to describe their own land. And in some ways, Sumner perhaps thought that he could get away with purchasing this land, which obviously belonged to the indigenous people there, and just recognize them with a mere land acknowledgement by calling it Alaska.
And so, kind of stepping into our present moment, what parallels do you see between Sumner's time and our current debates?
We see a number of parallels, most of which I think are obvious. We see deep partisanship. We see senators experiencing death threats. We see questions about the future of American democracy. And we're having heated debates about American law and about the Constitution. Sumner is relevant to all of these things in ways that I think are really striking. And to me, what especially stands out is Sumner's attitude during the secession winter, and a time when the future of America was under threat, when there were questions about what the country would look like, if it would even exist, whether the Constitution would survive that particular crisis. And Sumner didn't have answers for what was going to happen. In fact, for the first few weeks of secession winter, he wasn't even sure whether the North should go to war with the South or just let the South leave. But he did know one thing, which is that under no circumstances was he going to compromise on human rights. That's what led to his break with Seward. Sumner said that there are few who can stand firm like the oak tree against the storm. The implication being that Sumner was going through a political storm, and yet he was going to stand firm like an oak tree for principle, no matter what, and see what could happen next. And I think there's a lesson in that we can learn today.
And this was a fantastic book, and I'm sure when people finish it, they're going to want to know more about you. So where can people go and learn about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, thank you very much. I will say the audiobook of the book is out now, and you should definitely check that out. It's really good, if I have to say so myself. You're lucky because I didn't narrate it myself. There's a narrator who did it. And there's a website, charles-sumner.co. It's a place where someone can go to learn more. But really, the best way to learn more is to buy the book. And I appreciate everyone for listening.
And this is a comprehensive biography, so we've really only scratched the surface. But before I let you go, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you want future readers to know?
Even as I talk about Sumner as a political figure, as a legal thinker, as a foreign policy mastermind, and as an imperfect human being, as part of that, I try to show his full picture. And I talk about his love life, which was pretty dismal. He was incredibly lonely for most of his life. He was searching for a woman to love. He had many eligible suitors. After all, he's 6'4". So there were many women fawning over him, and he just couldn't seem to take an interest in any. He got very close to a man named Samuel Gridley Howe. Together, they would go on horseback rides into the countryside, and then return, go to a pub, order strawberries and cream, and spend all night talking and commiserating over their shared experience of bachelorhood. Howe ultimately does get married, and when he does, Sumner is heartbroken. He said, "We are like two ships passing in the ocean." Howe said that he felt like he had gone to heaven with his wife and left his best friend outside. For the rest of their life, Sumner and Howe would write letters to each other. Howe frequently burned their letters out of fear that they would one day be seen by, quote, unsympathetic eyes. We don't know what those letters contained in them. I speculate that Sumner was probably gay, insofar as a modern term means much when applied to the past.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big caveat here, which is that the term homosexual did not enter the English lexicon until the 1870s. Back in the 1840s, there was no vocabulary to describe what this relationship might have been. But to me, it suggests that Sumner was indeed in love with Samuel Howe, and for the rest of his life, he's depressed and sad as he goes through this. And I talk about that to try to humanize Sumner and to give a fuller picture of who he was and what he went through and what he struggled for.
Yeah, it was a very poignant part of the book, so very well done.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I've got to let you go, but for the listeners out there, please make sure to grab your copy of Charles Sumner, either the physical book or the audiobook. It is an engrossing, comprehensive analysis of one of the most important senators in American history, and you will not be able to put it down. Thank you, Zaakir, for coming on. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks again to Zaakir for spending his time with me. And as he mentioned during the interview, Charles Sumner, Conscience of a Nation is now available on audiobook. So you have 2 ways to enjoy this fantastic book. This biography is incredibly relevant to our current moment and is written in such an accessible way that you won't be able to put it down. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next week. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.